Welcome to CNN Talk, where we're talking about vaping. Is vaping dangerous to teenagers? The question really off the back of regulation, actually. The talk about increasing the age where you can start vaping, because not that there's a huge amount of evidence against it, but there's not enough evidence to show whether or not it's safe. What are your thoughts on this as a former Home Secretary?
And mother of just out of teenage boys.
Probably more importantly.
who I've done extensive research with, I have to say, this morning.
And they did vape?
They did vape. Yeah, they did vape. And interestingly, so I sort of thought, well, this disproves the idea that people vape as a way of stopping smoking. But interestingly, what they said to me when I was talking to them about it this morning was, we vaped instead of smoking because we were in social environments, pubs, etc., well, outside pubs now, where lots of our friends were smoking, and we would rather vape than smoke. So I think it's really difficult, actually, in terms of what the alternative would be.
But if there was no smoking previously, would you support vaping?
Well, I don't support it. I wasn't thrusting vapes upon them.
Happy 16th
Along with the
birthday, here's your first vape.
With broccoli.
I would rather they were living healthy lives, and not doing anything bad. But they're 20 and 25-year-old boys, so...
Yeah.
See, my kids are
20 and 25-year-old men.
Sorry,
yeah.
No, they'll always be my boys.
Well, mine are 10, 7 and 10 months, so mine are about to face all of this.
And how will you handle it?
Well, I'd like to think I'm obviously not going to be like this. I'd be a bit laissez-faire in the sense of, people make their own mistakes when they get to a certain age. But I'm sure I won't. I don't love the idea of it. I don't love the idea of it being seen by kids as it's a really safe alternative to smoking. I think it's being marketed, particularly in the States, as try this lovely apple-flavoured smoky thing. It's still nicotine. It doesn't seem implausible to me that someone might vape a bit and smoke a bit. So, people will make their own mistakes anyway, so you can't stop people smoking. But I don't look at this and think vaping is the great answer, except if you're already a heavy smoker and it's a good way out of it.
We'll look at the numbers later, but it's been explosive, partly because it's a new product, but every year more and more young people and adults are using them. Have you got any concerns?
Not particularly. I think if you are a heavy smoker and you move to vaping, my partner smoked 30 a day for 30, 40 years, was desperate to give up, tried everything possible, but nothing worked, and switched to vaping, uses IQOS things, which I think are a slightly different form of vaping. But I do think they are addictive, but it's only got 5% of nicotine. So from a health point of view, you'd have to argue that if you're given the choice, that is a better thing to do. And there's no evidence so far that they cause any other damage. I think from a kid's point of view, there is a certain glamour about smoking. And you think back to the adverts in the 60s, and that it was glamorized. Vaping, I think you look an absolute idiot with one of those things in your hand, frankly. There's nothing glamorous about vaping, is there?
And smoking's not glamorous anymore. I think when I was
growing up...
I
think it still is for 13, 14 year
Yeah,
olds. I think it is.
I was a bit shocked at how many people who were sort of teens, who were teenagers, who were still smoking. Notwithstanding there's been a big fall in smoking, I think, for other people. It still has got a bit of...
Has it fallen for teenagers?
I think it has, but even so, there are still too many teenagers.
It's so expensive.
Because, it's not just 5% of the nicotine, it's 5% of the carcinogenic content of cigarettes that vaping has.
As far as we know.
Because smoking, but what we do know is that smoking cigarettes is enormously dangerous for you as an individual.
But that's because of the research has been done over a period of decades. We don't yet have it on vaping, right?
True, and I don't dispute that. I think there's a need to do more research, although we do know some things. Like, I think we know that there is less nicotine in vapes in Europe than there is in the US. There's a limit in Europe. Thank goodness for the EU, we say.
Oh, here we go. We're not allowed to talk about that.
I was going to say.
Shall I ask? So Sanjay's going to join us for the main show, just so you know, and that's a poetry.
Yeah. An expert. You've decided to introduce someone who knows what they're talking about.
Welcome to CNN Talk. We're talking about vaping today because there's some concern about the age limit on vaping. Should teenagers be allowed to vape? The question we're asking you today.
Youth vaping is a public health crisis.
Over 3 million youth that are potentially addicted to e-cigarettes.
1 million more kids this year versus last year are doing this.
You know, one teen said that he was so addicted to vaping, he had to go to rehab for a month.
Overnight, he went from being a straight A, outgoing, fun student to a monster.
I've had vomiting, I've had fatigue, I've had headaches.
The FDA is now even looking into multiple reports of people who had seizures after vaping.
But the health of our children is literally at stake.
It's more than just an addiction problem right now. It's definitely an epidemic.
On our Facebook feed, people are getting involved. Ashley says, of course it's dangerous for teenagers, though. Olaf says,
can you do that again?
It's teenage language. We're getting down.
Yeah.
Olaf says,
teenage language?
well, it used to be
30 years ago, when you were a teenager.
Olaf says, it will get them addicted to nicotine. Isabel says, we need to ban fruity and sweet-flavoured products and raise the nicotine age limit to 21. On this issue, let's ask the former Home Secretary on whether or not this should be regulated, because so far there's no evidence that it's particularly bad, I don't think. Certainly not compared to smoking.
Well, it should be regulated. And I think there is a distinction between the regulation that we have in the UK, partly because of our membership of the EU, but because we tend to regulate more than the US. So I do believe that we should have regulation. I think we should limit the age. I'm not sure it needs to go up to 21. And we should limit the ability to market. And we do, in fact, in the UK. And I think that's part of the reason for the distinction. So Public Health England, for example, think actually that vaping has a really important role to play in helping people to stop smoking, which is indisputably more dangerous than vaping is.
Let's just have a look at the growth in teen use of vaping, because the numbers are pretty extraordinary. We've got there 2017 compared to 2018. Numbers going up all the time. It's a relatively new product. Sanjay Gupta joins us as well for the show, and you've done an awful lot of research into this. Just talk to us about the dangers as you see it around vaping.
Well, you know, as you guys have been talking about, when you talk about the, sorry, I'm going to turn this, I'm hearing myself back in my ear, sorry about that. But when you talk about the developing brain, you're talking about something that is going to be more affected by what's in the vaping. Nicotine, this is not tobacco, but it is nicotine. It is these e-flavorings, some of these other chemicals. And, you know, there's pretty good data now to show that actually affects certain parts of the brain differently. And what's interesting in the developing brain, it may affect parts of the brain that are responsible for your ability to perceive risk, which is a little bit of a complicated concept. But basically, it's this idea that if that part of the brain is affected, you may not think of things as risky as you would if that part of the brain was not affected. So that means you may be more likely to continue an activity, more likely to engage in high-risk activities, which is part of the cycle of addiction that they talk about. That's one of the big concerns with regard to vaping. As was just commented on, it's not the same as combustibles. You're not actually smoking tobacco, so it is safer in that regard. But one of the concerns, again, when you think about the brain, is that what percentage of these kids are then going to go on to smoke combustible cigarettes? And there's some early data on that. The data is, around 20% to 30% I've seen. It's small numbers still, so, those numbers are going to change. But that's the big concern.
As a father, does that concern you?
It does a bit. I mean, I think that you can make an argument this should be a prescription product. This is, if you go to a doctor and say, I'm smoking 20 cigarettes a day, I need a safer product. We don't know how much safer it is. It clearly will be safer for the reasons we've just heard about. That seems like an eminently reasonable way. But I think there is this knock on vaping that people think it's safe. People think it's kind of fruity, these flavours. They think it's not as bad as smoking, which is true, and therefore it's not bad. And that seems to me to be not a brilliant position for a product to get into. I mean, if you could uninvent tobacco, you would uninvent it. So do you really need to invent an electronic version of it, which even if it has 5% of the effects of it, why do you need this product in the system except medically to wean people off cigarettes?
Ian, let's just show a couple of the products. I mean, these are a concern to many, candy-flavoured vapes. So that's attractive, obviously, to younger children. We thought these are the sorts that you would smoke if you were...
Me?
Oh, yes.
Bling vapes. No, but they're all designed to appeal to younger people, right?
I see Ian with a pipe vape.
Thank you.
Look, cigarettes for teenagers have always been a bit like catnip. People have thought they were glamorous, and if you're 13, 14 years old, you like doing something that's a bit on the edge. And of course, in the 50s and 60s and 70s, smoking was seen as a bit on the edge. Now, habits have changed since then. But of course, the people who market these products are going to try and make them appeal to as many people as possible. So you'll have the adult vaping stuff, and you'll also have the kids vaping units. Now, vaping is not cool. It doesn't look cool in the same way that I think smoking a cigarette was made to look cool, admittedly by all the sort of like the Marlboro advertising and whatever in decades gone by. So I think kids want to do things which maybe their friends are doing, and I think that will account for a large part of the rise that we saw in America. I'm pretty sure it would be the same in this country. You've got now vaping shops, e-cigarette shops springing up on the high street all over the place. Now, you said that there was regulation about how these things can be marketed. You look through the windows of those shops and I can't see how they are being regulated, because you look at the packaging that is here. We have plain packaging in cigarettes. We certainly don't have that on e-cigarettes.
Jackie was talking earlier about Public Health England. This is what they said. When combined with expert face-to-face support, they were almost twice as effective at helping smokers to quit as other nicotine replacements, such as patches and gum. What's your view? What's the medical profession's view on them? Do they do more benefit than harm, arguably, Sanjay?
I think they can be quite beneficial. When you talk about the impact, and I apologize again, I'm just hearing all this noise in my ear, but the smoking cessation part of it, which is how this started, the acronym was ENDS, Electronic Nicotine Delivery Systems. So ENDS was how all of these different technologies are lumped together. And they did look at these studies. They compared it to other types of smoking cessation devices, gums, patches, things like that. And they found them, I think it was the numbers, if I remember correctly, close to 20% effectiveness for the vaping versus closer to 9 or 10% for the other products. Keep in mind, we're talking about one of the most addictive substances on the planet, tobacco smoking. So those numbers are not great, but they're better than we've heard in the past, 20%. One of the issues, though, Max, was then the follow-up question. So you've quit smoking. How likely are you to be continuing to use the smoking cessation device? And what they found with vaping was that about 90% of people who successfully quit smoking combustibles were still vaping. Just a data point. Take that for what it's worth. So people actually transition from the combustibles to the vaping, and in pretty good frequency. And again, that's a safer alternative. I think most people would agree with that. But if the goal ultimately is to stop completely, that's a harder goal to achieve here, I think, with vaping.
Diane says, stop regulating people into a coma. Ithaca says it's difficult to regulate an addicted behaviour. And this is something that you had to deal with in office with smoking, cigarettes, right?
I don't think regulation is that difficult. I mean, I was proud to be part of a government in the UK that banned smoking in public places. And some of the work I now do is in the health service. And, health people tell me time after time that the biggest impact on the health of the adult population in the UK has been banning smoking. So regulation can work. I think in this case, I've done some extensive research this morning, Max.
With two people?
With my two sons. But the interesting thing about them is that actually they started vaping not because they smoked and wanted to stop smoking, but because their friends smoked and they didn't want to start smoking. So it was an alternative to smoking. Probably about, I'm not sure they wholly told me the truth.
Let's take 2 years off whatever they say.
I suspect 16, 17, something like that.
But then they gave up recently.
But interestingly, they then gave up.
Why?
And because they were concerned about what the impact of it might be. And what my oldest son said was, look, you might expect him to say this, I don't think it's about the law, Mum. I think it's about more education. And I think, some of the things that Sanjay said are really interesting that I'm not sure young people know about the potential impact on their developing brains of vaping. Yes, it's safer than cigarettes, but it ain't safe.
The brain stuff that we just heard about, that's totally new to me. And that indicates that it is a drug in exactly the same way that we think of cannabis as a drug. Cannabis affects the way the brain works. So if that is the case here, then it has to be regulated. And at the moment, I'm not a great fan of over-regulation. I think people do have the right to decide what goes into their bodies. However, if it has that kind of effect, and that research is really only in its infancy, you do then wonder why health authorities, particularly Public Health England, as we've seen here, and I know other stuff I've read on that, they've positively welcomed e-cigarettes.
The argument for regulating cannabis is that kids particularly get cannabis anywhere. At the minute, they get very dangerous versions of it, a skunk, very, very strong, which can cause psychosis. So it seems to be the argument in favour of regulating cannabis is effectively to say, create safer products that people are going to be consuming anyway. You just find a way of making it less dangerous. This is a slightly different thing because it's a relatively new technology. If kids couldn't get access to e-cigarettes, would they be getting sort of dodgier versions that are more harmful than would they be turning to cigarettes? That seems to be a question that you'd want to ask, because if you don't have to introduce this to children, to allow it to be sold at all, if it is genuinely a medical use to those who are heavy smokers, you could take it out of the commercial market direct entirely, could you not? You could just say it's a part of it's a pharmaceutical product that is sold via prescription through manufacturers to help people get off smoking. That is a completely different thing to a commercial product.
This is really interesting though, Stig, isn't it? And I'm not sure what my conclusion is here, but lots of people, and I don't subscribe to this view, would argue for the legalisation or the decriminalisation of cannabis on the basis that it will mean that you're less likely to undertake criminal behaviour or to use the most...
I would argue
use the most dangerous forms of cannabis. So arguably, therefore, tighter regulation and banning e-cigarettes for young people actually is going in the opposite direction and might lead you, as you say...
If they could get them...
But they are banned for young people.
You're right. No, you're right.
But under 18, you can't get them.
What we've seen here is, I'm afraid, the power of capitalism, because it is undoubtedly the case from what we've seen that e-vape companies are marketing to young people with the horrible flavours, with the types of packaging that we've seen. And if they can get away with that, I'm afraid that I think they will.
This is the market leader in the US. It's called a Juul, and it's a USB, and it's
I'm not allowed to
quite
try
funky. You're not? Well... No. We're indoors. I worry about your health.
Thank you. Thank you. My developing brain.
This is from Juul's statement. We do not want youth using our product. This is from Juul. It's antithetical to our mission. We have taken aggressive action. Nothing is more important to us than solving the problem of underage use. And Sanjay, they are doing as they say. They used to advertise, didn't they, to younger people, but they've got rid of that now. They're now very much targeting older people.
Yeah, look, it's a little bit tough to characterize it exactly. I mean, we did a lot of reporting on this. Clearly, you showed the flavors and things like that, and the concern was that was marketing to young people. There was lots of social media sort of advertising using young people, glamorizing young people using vaping. Someone commented earlier it wasn't seen as glamorous as smoking, but if you look at a lot of these social media ads, there is a glamour to it, and I think that was part of the concern. As you may know, the first lawsuit has now been filed by a state in the United States, North Carolina, filing a lawsuit against Juul. And you've all heard of Juul, but Juul, I mean, I have 3 kids, 13, 12, and 10. Everybody knows Juul in this country. I mean, it's amazing to me. No one knew it a couple of years ago. That term wasn't something that people really talked about. And now even my 10-year-old, everybody knows this term. How do they know this? Where is it coming from? That's a little bit of what this lawsuit is about in North Carolina, focusing specifically on deceptive marketing. Juul says, as you pointed out, Max, that they deny those allegations. But, you have 1.5 million more middle school and high schoolers using these types of devices as compared to a year before that. So the numbers are around 3.5 million now, 3.6 million, I believe, which is a lot. And it's 1.5 million more than the year before. So that shows you not only how many children are doing this, but how rapidly the growth has been as well.
This is a Juul. No, that's not actually. This is the Juul campaign from 2015, very clearly targeting them, but they don't do these types of campaigns anymore.
And also, Juul is an American brand. I don't think it's a particularly well-known brand over here, so it seems to have, the American market and the UK market seems to be rather different. I find it fascinating that we're talking about a product, and from what I can see, we don't fully know the chemical constituent parts of this product. This is a product that's been allowed to market. It's restricted its use, but it's still allowed to market. And no one can definitively say what chemicals are created in what way when this happens. Is that not Is that not surprising that this exists as a product without fully knowing the chemical constituent parts?
Do we know what's in it, Sanjay?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point, and we don't know. There's been a few studies on this where you have independent labs and stuff looking into it. So you have nicotine, you have the heating coil, which is heating this e-liquid, which is the nicotine and other chemicals. What Jewel will say is, look, for the most part, it's the nicotine. That is the ingredient. The question that has come up is, what exactly is this in this e-liquid? Are there heavy metals in this e-liquid? And also, when you heat it, does the nature of this entire substance change in some way? Does it change into something that could potentially be more harmful? I don't want to suggest that it does, but to your point, we don't know. You take this thing, it's a relatively new concoction, this nicotine and e-liquid. You heat it up. Is there a dose-dependent curve to this? Does it change the more you use it? Do you accumulate any of these substances, including the heavy metals, into your body? Is that different for the growing body versus an adult body? All these, I mean, it's amazing because we don't have definitive answers to these questions, and yet, you got millions of kids who are using it.
Absolutely. Stephen says, isn't it a better alternative, though, for them to take part in than taking up smoking? Ramesh says, control guns first. Risa,
I think we can all agree with that comment.
Risa, to your point, says teens aren't really vaping to quit smoking. There is this sort of, a lot of people are just starting vaping, so it's not necessarily a good alternative.
They might be vaping instead of smoking. That's, I think we don't know. I mean, one of the conclusions of this discussion today has been we don't know.
No.
So we're not completely sure what the content is. We're not completely sure what the impact is on young people, although Sanjay is very convincing in what he's described. We're not completely sure about the distinction in the regulation and what would be effective. I think what it means is you're probably going to need to take a wide approach that includes some regulation, some education of young people about the real impact, and some research into what's actually happening.
Let us know what you think on our Facebook feed. We'll be back in just a moment.
It's not a mystery, it's there. Gotcha. You can't say what's in it.
Well, it's there because the tobacco companies knew that they were going to be almost regulated out of existence.
So they needed
a replacement. So Philip Morris...
is it all the same companies producing the vaping?
Oh, yeah. I think so. Sanjay may know better than I do.
They're investors, for sure, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
But you look at... I mean, Philip Morris are brilliant marketeers, and when they decided to go into this, they did a huge amount of investment, and they produced these IQOS cigarettes, and they do have, I think, more nicotine in them than some of the others. But they look kind of cool. The packaging, when you get them, because you order them in packs of 100, it looks like you're getting an iPhone. It's that sort of nice, white, clean packaging. And it is kind of cool in a sense, but they're very expensive.
Mm. But there's a moment where they could have not been allowed to market. I mean, within the realm of a pharmaceutical product, it would be tested, its constituent parts have to be analysed, and then it would have been approved for certain uses. That seems like the route to how pharmaceuticals are regulated. And we've gone to this massive effort of regulating cigarettes, going from zero regulation back in the 50s to really intrusive regulation now. That's a massive journey, took a lot of effort, a load of lobbying fights. It seems funny that we've sort of sold the pass on this so quickly.
Coming back to the TV show. Welcome to CNN Talk. We're talking about these things. They are vapes? What do they call them? Vapes.
That doesn't look cool.
E-cigarettes.
No. This one really doesn't.
No.
But that's the interesting development, isn't it? That looks a lot cooler than that. And
yes.
People must know that.
So this is Jewel. I'm just going to show you this because this is quite interesting. So it depends, as you pointed out, I think, or you pointed out, there's a difference between Europe and America. And this is one of the key differences, nicotine content. So in the United States, the Juul has 59 milligrams, 20 milligrams in Europe. It's obviously more regulated in Europe.
But if you look at the strength of cigarettes, I mean, I remember when I left school, I went to live in Germany for a year, and literally everyone who was 18 in Germany at that point, early 1980s, smoked. So, and I'd never smoked in this country at school, bizarrely. So I went down to the local newsagent, bought a pack of 20 Camel cigarettes and smoked the lot of them, one after the other. And that put me off for life, because I couldn't see what the attraction was. And I suspect that for a lot of people who actually start with these, they might have the same experience. If they get the wrong taste, if they get the wrong strength, it's not actually automatic that you're going to continue doing it.
Sanjay, we were talking in the break about, this is a transition effectively for many of the cigarette companies. Is that true to say that cigarette companies are putting all of their efforts now into these and the investors are behind it as well?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of a surprising thing in a way. What you sort of see is that many of these tobacco companies, in part because of declining sales of combustible cigarettes, have started to become investors and developers within the e-cigarette market. Now, some would say, is that robbing Peter to pay Paul a little bit, right? Because these are supposed to be smoking cessation devices. But when you see that they're putting these investments in, you realize that, what's going on? What's the bigger play here? And I think part of it comes back to this number that our former FDA commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, would talk about all the time. He would say that if a younger generation of people are going to start smoking combustible cigarettes, start through vaping, but then go to combustible cigarettes, around 23% again was a number he would quote, that is not worth the risk of having a smoking cessation device on the market. So the cigarette companies are saying, well, look, maybe this is going to get people into combustibles again, younger people who actually the numbers are starting to decline in terms of smoking, not go up. If this actually increases the numbers, you could understand maybe why the cigarette companies are starting to invest in this.
Cyrus says he used vaping to quit smoking cigarettes.
I think that's a distinct. I really do think there's two things here. There's a kind of recreational vaping versus a medical approach to stopping smoking. And if we've learned anything about the history of tobacco companies, is they are an immoral source of lobbying to achieve their own commercial
And they're
ends.
very powerful.
And
lobbyists.
they're very, very good at it. It just seems striking to me that if it is plausible that you could have kids on who vape, who then smoke more than they otherwise would have had vaping not existed, and the tobacco business is funding that, that slightly feels that we've not learnt the lessons of the 1960s
I'll tell you what,
and 70s.
I'd love to regulate out of existence the public vaping. Last night, going into the station, and there's just plume of vaping
This is
smoke.
what Anna says on Facebook. Vaping and smoking are both selfish habits.
Because they do impact on other people. I think that's true. Just to come to this lobbying point, I remember I went to the Conservative Party conference last year. I went with you.
Oh, yes, you did.
It's very memorable.
Yeah, you enjoyed having me there.
What happens at conference stays at conference.
Well, all right, but I will just say that in the exhibition hall, there was an enormous Philip Morris stand.
Was there?
Yeah, so obviously they felt
a lot of money on lobbying.
it was worth their while to be there with the government of the
gives them
day.
an acceptable face again. I mean, if you imagine, if you're a lobbyist for a tobacco company, the last 10, 20 years have been pretty awful for you. You can't go anywhere without anyone throwing things at you.
You can go to Conservative Party conference.
They'll let anyone in, as we've just demonstrated.
If they pay.
But the thing is, if the tobacco companies get a more acceptable face, that's the real risk here, isn't it?
But just one point here, and Sanjay, I'd be interested to hear your view on this. We're talking about vaping. Childhood obesity is a far bigger risk to people's health than vaping ever is. And yet, you look at the lack of regulation of the food industry. I mean, it's a joke compared to the cigarette industry.
And you've reported on both, Sanjay.
Yeah, well, look, I have strong opinions on this. I mean, first of all, smoking leads the number one cause of preventable death in the developed world. So that's smoking. There is no redeeming qualities when it comes to combustible smoking. Leave aside vaping for a second, and you're not getting calories from it. It just is besides an addiction, it's just it's a source of disease. With food, even if it's bad food, you could make the argument that there are some redeeming qualities to it, right? I mean, you are providing calories to people who need it. And if you are living near the poverty line, you're going to be more likely to buy bad calories. That's more of a socioeconomic issue in some way. But I get the concern and the public health impact of obesity on chronic disease. Smoking's still far worse, but one has no redeeming qualities and one has many redeeming qualities. You got to provide nutrition to people. It's a question of how to provide better nutrition, not simply outlawing it. With regard to cigarettes, combustibles, and again, if vaping is leading more people to start smoking combustible cigarettes, you can see the problem there. So I do put these in different buckets in that regard.
What's the next shift you expect in vaping? What are you looking for?
It's really interesting. So Scott Gottlieb, who I was mentioning earlier, FDA commissioner, has left that job now. It'll be interesting to see who comes into the job. He was as hard a liner on this as we have seen, although even if you look at the FDA, the stance on this, they talk about the fact that they essentially are holding off until 2021 to really allow these ENDS companies, these electronic nicotine delivery system companies, such as Juul, to provide data on smoking cessation, some of which we've talked about. They want more data, and they also want evidence that this is not going to be something that is, marketed to kids. They've taken some of those steps already in this country, so many of those flavorings that you've shown, Juul, for example, cannot sell those flavorings anymore. The device itself has to be purchased in an age-restricted store. So they have these stores that are sort of vape shops, things like that. You can't walk into any rest stop at a gas station and buy it anymore like you used to be able to, although people circumvent that. But those are some of the things that are happening now. Probably not till 2021, Max, will we have something more definitive from the FDA.
Safa says, vaping makes me feel good. Tim says, will this be the next major health epidemic? He's watching from Hong Kong. And the danger for Helen is that vaping just looks trendy. Sanjay, thanks for joining us today.
You got it.
Ian doesn't think it's trendy. He is a trendsetter, so we should listen to him on that.
Ian is the arbiter of cool.
I thought that was you.
Gauge the reaction. Thank you for watching.